You know, I feel like in photography, if there is one single skill that every photographer across different genres should have, it is to make your subject stand out. Because if your subject does not stand out, the viewer doesn't know what they're going to look at, and your photo is not really going to make any impact. And in today's video, I want to share with you how I make my subject stand out, not through shallow depth of field, but by using purely the light that is available to you. In the first part of the video, I'm going to show you how we can use direct sunlight to make our subject stand out, but make sure to stick till the end where I'm going to show you how you can also make your subject stand out if the light is totally boring, like on a cloudy grey day, for instance. So I would say without further ado, let's get started. This is not good. Why the f? Okay, better. First, let me explain to you what my general philosophy is when I use light to make my subject stand out. And that philosophy is contrast. In other words, it's brightness difference between the brightest parts in your scene and the darkest parts of your scene. And contrast is a really good tool because it guides the viewer's attention automatically to the most contrasty area in your frame. And contrast, generally speaking, works in two different ways. The first way is that you have a dark subject on a bright background. And the other way is that you have a bright subject on a dark background. And as you can see here, for instance, you have all of these circles, but which circle is capturing your attention the most? Well, let me guess, it is the white circle, despite the white circle being the smallest. And the reason why it's standing out the most is because the brightness difference between the dark background and the white circle is biggest, and the viewer is automatically guided towards that bright circle. And now that we have the theory down, let's assess how we can use contrast in practice using direct light first. And the easiest way to achieve contrast between your subject and the background is to use backlighting. In other words, you make sure that the sun is within 180 degrees behind your subject. And the reason why backlighting automatically generates contrast is because the sun is standing behind us, so the background will be bright, while the subject, or at least the side of the subject that's facing the camera, is going to be in the shadow. So we have a dark subject, or a darker subject, and we have a bright background creating the contrast. But there is one important aspect that we should also mention here, which is the angle at which the sun is shining from behind. And the angle is important because if the sun is standing right behind your subject, it generates a huge brightness difference, and the camera has limited dynamic range, so limited possibilities to capture the brightest to the darkest values in one single photo, and this usually leads to your subject turning into a silhouette. On the other hand, however, if the sun is standing relatively high, you can still backlight, but now the sun is not standing in your frame anymore, which means that the dynamic range or the brightness difference is now much more manageable. And that leads to the camera be able to properly expose the shadows, so your subject will be more visible, but also the highlights, given the brightest highlights, the sun, is not in your frame. Alternatively, you can also make sure that your subject is visible by backlighting by just having the sun stand behind your subject but slightly off angle. So not right behind your subject, but a little bit more from the side. And here the idea behind it is the same. We make the dynamic range of the scene more manageable by making sure that the brightest part in our scene, the sun, is not actually in our photo. So next time you go out and try to backlight, always bear in mind what you actually want to reveal and what you want to conceal. Because if you want to reveal more of your subject, then it might be better if the sun is either standing slightly higher or if the sun is slightly standing off angle, because that reveals more of your subject. And similarly, if you're somebody like me and you absolutely love silhouettes, then you also don't care about the fact that your subject is not really visible. And you know, I'm getting a lot of questions about the way my photos look, whether I'm using recipes, whether I'm using presets, or what's the magic behind my photos. And honestly, it is the way I use the light. And today I'm actually beyond excited to announce the release of my newest book, Catch the Contrast, the guide on how to read the light, in which I'm explaining in depth my theory that I use to read the light in literally any conditions, what impact different light directions have on your scene, and I'm giving you a really good foundation so that you can read the light no matter what the light conditions are. And this book has been developed over years of trial and error, seeing what works and what does not. So it can save you a whole lot of time learning how to read the light and how to use light in your photography more effectively to improve your photos so much more than a new camera or a new lens ever could. So feel free to check it out via this QR code or the link down below in the description. And I'm launching it at a 20% discount until the end of the year, so make sure not to miss that offer. But now, let's get back to the video. Alright, so far we've been talking about backlighting. Now let's assess how we can achieve contrast and make our subject stand out using side lighting and front lighting. And let's start with side lighting first. So side lighting is effectively when the light is coming from the left side of your camera or from the right side of your camera. And it also works relatively well at establishing contrast, especially when the sun is standing at a relatively low angle. Because as the sun lowers, you will also see how the shadows will become bigger and bigger. And this means that you can actually have your subject side lit while the background behind the subject can be in the shadow. This is actually also a similar strategy that I use right now with this studio lamp, because I'm illuminated, but since I'm side lit, so the sun, or well, this softbox here is shining in this direction, the background behind me is actually dark, which is the same phenomenon. So we achieve contrast because I'm bright while the background behind me is dark. But front lighting, however, is a little bit more tricky because the sun is coming from behind you, the photographer, and shining toward your subject. The problem, however, is that since your subject is frontally lit, the sun is also giving the same illumination to the background. Let's illustrate this with Commander Rex here, for instance. Here we have the backlit photo of Mr. Rex, here we have the side lit photo, and here we have the front lit photo. I don't know which one you prefer, but I find that the front lit photo looks terribly flat. In other words, we don't have any nuance, we don't have any contrast, and Commander Rex, as well as the background, are lit in the same intensity. So how are we going to fix this front lighting issue? Well, either you can just do it like I did for way too long, which is to just avoid front lighting altogether. Alternatively, however, you can just slightly change the way your subject and the camera are turned toward the light. So instead of the light just hitting the subject from the front, make sure that the light is hitting the subject off angle from a 45-degree angle, for instance. And technically we are cheating and we're moving into side lighting territory, but now what happens is that the sun is actually coming slightly from the side and the background is now so much more likely to fall into darkness. So in other words, by having the sun stand slightly off angle from the camera, we can achieve the front lit look without actually front lighting according to the literal definition. But now we have a little bit of a problem, which is that we have assumed that we actually have direct sunlight, but that's not always the case, because I am, for instance, currently sitting here in Vienna, Austria in winter, and we have not seen the sun here in weeks. And I recently read that our neighboring city of Linz actually has an even worse time than Vienna because they have had only 5 minutes of sun since the beginning of December. And for photographers, especially when we want to make our subject stand out through contrast, that's a bit of a problem because the sky diffuses the sunlight and evenly spreads it out. Everything is somewhere in the midtones, as we call it, and that's a problem because it makes it really hard to achieve contrast. But don't worry, I actually do have 3 fixes for this particular issue. The first one is to shoot from a dark area into a bright area. Imagine, for instance, you're at a train station or you're in a tunnel and you're shooting toward the exit of the tunnel. And given it's relatively dark in the tunnel and relatively bright outside of the tunnel, you can actually create contrast by, for instance, having a subject walk toward the exit, making the subject stand out because of this brightness difference between relative brightness outside and relative darkness inside the tunnel. The next way to make your subject stand out, even when you have a dull, flat, boring sky, is to actually shoot into the sky. And no, I'm not asking you to shoot into the sky like this, but I'm asking you to shoot bottom up. So you shoot from down below a little bit toward the sky, so a little bit upwards. And by doing so, your sky will actually become the background. And the sky, despite being cloudy, is still our brightest light source. So by slightly shooting upwards into the sky, we can actually make our subject stand out for two reasons. First of all, because relatively speaking, our subject is darker than the sky. And the second reason is that the sky does not have a lot of texture. In other words, our texture-rich subject is going to pull the viewer's eye towards it because that's where you have the most details, while in the sky there is basically nothing. It serves as negative space. The next approach is to look for a pop of color. In other words, you look for something colorful, which is especially useful if everything around it is sad, gray, and just a boring soup. So in other words, in this gray environment, we are looking for a color contrast, something that contrasts given the color and saturation difference instead of brightness difference per se. So once, for instance, I made a funny self-experiment where I was just observing and trying to find in my environment red umbrellas, because umbrellas are already just fun to photograph, but if they're also red, they stand out from the mass. And you might intuitively think, oh, but it's very unlikely that I'm going to see a red umbrella, for instance. But honestly, once you start looking for something, you will actually see that it's quite likely that you see umbrellas once you start consciously looking for them. And of course, it doesn't have to be umbrellas. It can also be, I don't know, hats, or it can be something yellow, maybe? It's totally up to you, but focus on one single thing and you will see how this will automatically elevate your subject, making it stand out, because everything around your colorful subject is totally boring. And by the way, all the tips and tricks that I shared today are part of my new book, so feel free to check that out here. Or if you're interested in learning how to read the light at night specifically, then I highly invite you to check out this video up here. And with that being said, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I'm gonna see you in the new one. Bye.